today was day 3 down at the Manhattan courthouse where Do Kwon and Terra are taking on the SEC. And it was kind of a rough day for both Do and Terra in court, as the SEC did a pretty good job of introducing a healthy amount of suspicion for the jury members. All 9 New Yorkers that we already covered on day 2 and day 1 of the trial started to visibly look a little curious as to what's going on in this case. So let's jump right in. From the jump, there was a little bit of drama in the fact that the defense moved for a mistrial due to the way that Judge Rakoff has been jumping in and asking witnesses questions of his own. Particularly from yesterday, the defense was a little bit concerned with the way that Judge Rakoff had posed one question to the witness that also kicked off today, saying whether or not lying to the public influenced certain things for him and the investment he made at Galaxy Digital into Terra. And the defense, unsurprisingly, didn't really like that phrasing and moved for a mistrial, which Judge Rakoff denied. And that kind of set the tone for, I think, what the day was going to be. The rest of the testimony from Galaxy's investor, Mr. Cole, was otherwise unnoteworthy for the beginning of the day. And then we moved into the next witness, which was far more interesting in that it's a key witness for what the SEC is, of course, trying to do in showing that Terra misled investors by flexing the ability of Chai Payments, the network that Do Kwon and his co-founder Daniel Shin had founded, flexed beyond what was true in the way that Chai was using the Terra blockchain. The next witness was actually not in person, it was on video, and it was a company representative there to answer questions in a deposition form that was binding on Terraform Labs. I gotta say, the witness that they had in this video, I wish I could show you clips, but the guy was just generally one of the most guilty looking people I've seen on video in the way that he was answering questions and his eyes were darting around, and each question he took about like 15-30 seconds to think about things. Visibly winced when he was asked a few questions on video. Basically sat there trying to, what looked like, figure out a way to not get in trouble by lying, but also not necessarily answering the questions that were being asked. The other piece of that was that the Terraform Labs attorneys jumped in at certain points in the video to say, we have corrected the record of what that person said in the video, especially when it came to, again, the key piece of what the SEC is trying to get the jury to think was a lie, in the way that they said certain payments at Chai were recorded on the Terra blockchain, when in fact the SEC is trying to get the jury to understand and agree with them that they weren't, and that that was a material lie. They basically jumped in and tried to correct the record of a certain timeline for when the Chai payments were actually using the Terraform blockchain. And that was back in June of 2019, which was what the statement was read in court, basically saying that after looking back at the records, it was in fact the case that Chai was using the Terraform blockchain. And that's where we got into more of the specifics. But I think the SEC did a pretty good job of at least planting the seed among the jury members, basically trying to watch this video, planting the seed of doubt in the way that this man was answering the questions in the video, and also, I think, having the jury start to lean forward a little bit in their chairs, saying what really is going on between Chai and Terra. And that's when they called their next witness, which was in person and a pretty key witness for what the SEC is now trying to do as they move past just planting the seeds of doubt and now really hammering the point home that something was going on here. And that's when they called Chai's former chief product officer, Aaron Mong, onto the stand. And I gotta say, this is a pretty interesting person to bring up, just in the fact that he recorded conversations with basically everybody at Chai, and also had conversations with Do Kwon about this specific issue. His background's pretty interesting when you think about a character witness to bring up to talk about this particular issue of Chai versus Terra, because of his relationship with both Do and Daniel Shin. Let's get into that then, shall we? So Aaron Mong went to the University of Michigan and lives in Seoul, Korea, even though he was born in California. And his relationship with Korea is actually a point of contention that I think on day 4, the defense is really going to start to lean into to kind of undermine his testimony. But basically, his background was a product manager at Palm and then Salesforce, a guy who worked in tech, and then went over because he knew Daniel Shin as chief product officer at Chai, where he was working on payments, product design, oversaw all those teams. 9 product managers reported to him. So this guy was very much leading things at Chai. Right off the bat, the SEC kind of dug into what he knew and what he saw. And it's pretty interesting to kind of think about how much has been talked about just in the public, if you followed this case, about how important Chai was to Terra. We already covered that in kind of day 1 and day 2. But this idea that so much of this was out there, the SEC off the top of this basically asked point blank, did at any point the Chai wallet use crypto for any payment transactions? He gave a one-word answer, never. Did Chai merchants get paid in crypto? Again, never. So this understanding, why did you take this job at Chai if you thought that that was the case? He basically said, because that's what Daniel Shin and Do Kwon led everyone to believe. And then they showed a few investor letters that he had received because he also invested into Terra through Encore, the fund that Daniel Shin had run, and showed some of those investor letters, again, flexing Chai and the uptake in that it was the 3rd most used blockchain between Bitcoin and Ethereum. And they asked him again, why was that so important? Does that matter? And he said, yes, because it means it has utility, it being Terra. And again, flexing that in their promotional materials, Terra had always boasted that Korea runs on Terra was essentially kind of the talking point. Anyways, it eventually convinced this guy, Aaron Mong, to take a job at Chai after he learned all of that stuff, and then very quickly realized that all of the things that led him to Chai were not in fact true. And that's essentially when he started recording all of his conversations, not just with Daniel Shin, but with Gigi Kwon, no relation, another person who was working at Chai and Terra before that. Basically, his tale of trying to get answers. It's worth noting that he is an SEC whistleblower, and the defense, at the end of the day, started to undermine the testimony by pointing out that he is an SEC whistleblower and stands to gain quite handsomely if, everything works out. SEC whistleblowers often are entitled to pretty serious rewards depending on how these cases go. He did mention that he was paid about $200,000 a year as a product manager at Chai, but was supposed to get millions of dollars, I believe $20 million in stock bonuses, but didn't actually get those. And so, it does paint a picture of maybe why he has an axe to grind, but we'll leave that for the defense to prove in day 4. As far as day 3 goes, the rest of it took a lunch break and then brought Aaron Mong back. And at that point, it's probably worth noting that a lot of this stuff was objected to. These calls that were brought into evidence were objected to by the defense team over and over and over again. It was a running objection for all of this in terms of relevance and foundation and the way that the SEC was trying to set these recordings up. I made a note and calculated how many times the defense team objected and how many were actually sustained. And they went like 3 out of 23. So that's not a good percentage. I think that's only like 13% on objections being sustained. So basically, Judge Rakoff not having any of what the defense was trying to block here, and also kind of had frequent sidebars just in kind of discussing what can and cannot be said during these testimonies. In general, though, the SEC, again, did a really good job of kind of floating these clips in front of the jury in context of things where it sounded very much like, yeah, we had a handshake deal, everything's fine. And they hammered that point home. Why was Chai not correcting the record anytime Do Kwon came out and said that they were using the Terra blockchain for payments? And that's essentially what Aaron Mong was trying to get out of Daniel Shin. And eventually they uncovered this quote-unquote gentleman's agreement where Do Kwon and Daniel Shin had basically agreed for 2 years to just not make any public mention that it might not be the case that Chai was using the Terra blockchain. And they asked Aaron why that might be. He made the point that a lot of Chai employees either had Luna tokens or, financial upside in Terra, as Daniel did, as Do did, to where it wouldn't really behoove anyone to have anyone think otherwise. And his whole story was that he didn't feel right about the marketing not being truthful in why would you keep perpetuating this lie. And that's where he started to move into recording all these conversations because he thought that something fishy was going on. Or to use the exact quote from him, I thought it was very sketchy, is what he said when the SEC asked him about how this was going and the idea of this quote-unquote gentleman's agreement. Mostly, again, because he said what Do was saying was, quote, completely false. They showed the screenshots of the back and forth between Aaron and Daniel Shin about that. They showed him raising the issue again on a separate call, which he recorded. They played clips of that and continued to, again, kind of play clips of all these conversations that Aaron had with other employees there. And then we had a lunch break. And so that was kind of the day, for the most part, because we only ended at 3:30. So it was only an hour after lunch. And it basically wrapped with the SEC closing on the point of, what was the point of all of this? Aaron simply said to lie. And there was one point where it really did start to hit home with the jury. I was watching them listen to all this, and it was quite interesting to see one of the points where they said, when you started to talk to Do Kwon about this, because eventually Chai was working on cross-border payments, which might want to actually utilize a blockchain, but maybe not necessarily Terra's blockchain. And there was a question as to how they would market it, as now they are using the blockchain when they had said they were before and actually weren't. And so Aaron said that when he talked to Do about all this stuff, he quoted Do as saying, I don't give an F about Chai. And when he said that line, particularly one of the jurors, one of the female jurors, I believe juror number 6, winced. Like, she actually winced and then shook her head as if to say, like, that's not great behavior. So it was kind of interesting. Again, the whole day, these jurors were actually quite engaged, not like what happened in the SBF trial. Those jurors were falling asleep by day 3. So these ones are, paying attention and actively reacting to what's being said at trial. So that's one thing that I think if you're in the courtroom, you would notice if you've been in both of these. This case is a bit different just in terms of the pace, the action, and how engaged the jury members are. All right, in the final 20 minutes of the day, the defense team took over with David Kornblau taking over on the cross with Aaron Mong. And it was kind of interesting because he came in a bit hot. Right off the top, he said, did you meet... This is pretty standard, by the way. Defense attorneys always ask in cross and try and show the jury that this happens, that they meet with the SEC, that they go over questions, they go over answers, and all of this is calculated to get the jury to think that someone's guilty, essentially. And so that's pretty commonplace to see a defense attorney ask, how many times did you meet with the SEC to go over this? Do you have a potential positive outcome for yourself as an SEC whistleblower? Judge Rakoff jumped in and basically shut that down and said, hey, jury, you should know that this is pretty common practice to meet with the SEC ahead of testimony. Where it was not common practice, though, is that the defense team pulled up what had been mentioned before, which was that Aaron Mong before ran a startup that basically had Koreans come into the U.S. to be interpreters or translators. And he got fined in Korea for that business and the way that he was running it, a pretty serious amount, and technically punishable up to a year in court, or up to a year in prison in Korea. Essentially, the defense team was trying to say that, look, you basically glossed over that one thing that happened in your past, essentially a crime, as a quote-unquote like slap on the wrist parking ticket. And then there was a weird back and forth between the defense attorney and Aaron, disagreeing over the translation of was it a crime or was it more of like a no-no. And they went back and forth on that. The SEC started to object, but it's very clear. I mean, this is character assassination is what it's called, or undermining the witness, which is standard practice for any defense attorney to basically get the jury to start to doubt everything that he said. That's essentially where we left things off, is this idea of, okay, how is the defense going to start to undermine what Aaron set up, which was pretty damning phone calls about, look, don't ask, don't tell, don't dig into this any further. This doesn't really concern you. Don't worry about the fact that Terra is in fact not being used by Chai for all of these payments. So it's a bit of the SEC telling the story. And again, we're only dealing with 2 prongs here in the fraud case. Judge Rakoff has been pretty straightforward with, you're really only focusing on 2 things. The SEC is first focusing here on whether or not Terra used Chai and whether that was misrepresented. It's, again, everything we covered already if you haven't watched it. in our exclusive interview with Do Kwon, the first one he gave after the $40 billion collapse. That was essentially, what was always going to be core to this case. And then the second prong we're going to get into later, which has to do with Jump Crypto and what they did in the first depegging. But that's day 1, 2, 3. I mean, we've covered it mostly all up until this point, haven't really left too much out, and it's only expected to go 2 weeks. So not a lot left really in this case. And interesting to kind of see the defense trying their best to do things and prevent some evidence from getting in. But really, honestly, you get the sense that Judge Rakoff is starting to lose patience a bit with kind of how long certain things are taking, and also the defense trying to throw some objections in there, which is always going to happen. But in general, pretty interesting to see them move for a mistrial, get that denied, and then have today go the way that it did. It almost makes me say that Terra and Do are slipping a little bit behind where you'd think they'd be. But again, the SEC gets to go first, the government always gets to go first, and the defense puts their case together. And we'll see how they refute some of what was said by Aaron Mong, since he is the guy who was there at Chai. It's going to be kind of tricky to fight back, I think, now at this point, to where the jury has those seeds of doubt already planted in their head. So that's day 3 in the books in Do Kwon and Terra versus the SEC. Please, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, throw a like on the video, and throw your questions in the comments below. Let me know, because I'm just kind of throwing out what I'm seeing here. If there are questions, happy to answer them, and let us know if we should keep doing this, because it's kind of tiring to do the tweet threads and the videos every day, and now also in the same day, just a couple floors up, SBF is also being sentenced on Thursday at the same courthouse. So a bit of 2 places at the same time, but I'll be popping back and forth. Anyways, thank you again for watching, and get all your crypto news as always. If you want to join our project or stake with our validators, head to coinage.media. I'm Zach Guzman, and we'll see you on day 4.